October 18, 1944. Aachen, West Wall. In a slit of black steel, a German lieutenant checks ranges and smiles at the math-interlocking MG arcs, pre-sighted mortar boxes, cupolas poured to shrug off 8-inch hits. Then the air thickens. A single slower thunder leans on the bunker like a giant's palm. Dust turns to fog. The roof groans as hairline cracks crawl like frost. Amerikaner, someone says, but not the Americans. They trained for something heavier, patient, precise. Another impact farther, then nearer, a bell tolling down the line. Confidence wavers. Concrete, for the first time, feels mortal. They had rehearsed this battle for years. The belt of pillboxes and dragon's teeth around Aachen was doctrine poured into stone, overlapping fields of fire-armored cupolas, emergency exits, splash walls, and range cards updated to the meter. Flak would shear low-flying attackers. Counter-battery would blind any rash gun line. The forts would survive until infantry relief arrived. Reports from Normandy had been folded into reassurance bombs, cratered fields, yes, but roofs endured. American artillery was quick and light, a storm you outlasted under concrete. Ammunition lay cached in color-coded alcoves. Telephone nets webbed the galleries. Sound-ranging teams traced hostile batteries like hunters reading spoor. The men were told they defended a physics problem with the answer already written. Thickness beats blast geometry, beats haste. The West Wall beats everything. They believed it because the math felt elegant, and because belief is a kind of armor. Their picture of the enemy was equally tidy, motorized, impetuous, obsessed with speed and quantity over weight. If a breach came, it would come at the wire under smoke or from aircraft, not from a single deliberate hammer. The plan, therefore, was simple. Endure the flurry, hold the line, counterpunch. Only later would they discover the Americans had brought a different equation. They laughed, because the picture they carried of the Americans was neat, comforting, and until very recently, useful. The U.S. Army, in their telling, loved speed and noise but not weight. It blanketed problems with smoke and steel of the lighter sort, the kind that shredded hedges and men, but left concrete yawning. They had studied the enemy's gunnery tables and after-action habits from Normandy through the Seine, and the pattern seemed fixed. Quick concentrations, agile batteries, leapfrogging forward on good roads, masses of 105s and 155s, speaking in staccato paragraphs. Terrifying to infantry in the open, yes, unsettling to fieldworks and farmhouses, but not a language that persuaded reinforced concrete. They mocked the American faith in aviation. Bombers could collapse city blocks. They could scorch marshalling yards. But the old forts had shrugged bombs for decades. Cupolas, dented roofs, scabbed galleries filled with dust. And then the defenders emerged, coughing but intact. The propaganda reels helped Americans dropping bridges of bombs while old forts stood like cliffs, a reassuring geometry. If the enemy believed that air power solved everything, let him waste his tonnage on the sky while the West Wall waited under the earth. They mocked the logistics that followed the Americans like a county fair, ice cream plants, bakeries under canvas, Coca-Cola bottling lines, PX trucks with stacks of magazines and candy, the endless convoys with tarpaulins tied square. Comfort, they said, made softness. Softness made brittle courage. An army that imported soda to the line would not endure the taste of concrete dust in its teeth. The Americans' love of schedules and their contempt for mud would pin them to paved arteries and predictable timetables. Cut the roads and the radios, and you cut the army. They mocked doctrine too. The American way of war, as they read it, worshipped dispersion and decentralization. Each battery its own small kingdom, each infantry battalion loudly supported but rarely coordinated beyond the horizon. The enemy fired much, adjusted quickly, but rarely reached for the kind of deliberate, crushing preparation that cracks fortresses. He liked to keep moving. He measured success in kilometers taken. He feared the pause that lets heavy guns grow roots. They do not siege a staff colonel, said chalk, squeaking a certainty across a map board. They bypass, they mask, they talk about mobility. Walls are not impressed. And they mocked the Americans' engineering instincts, too modular, too standardized, too committed to the idea that one tool mass-produced could solve many problems if you bought enough of it. Against armor in the open. Perhaps. Against a town with time. against a fort whose roof measured its dignity in meters and whose rebar sang under strain like a harp string. No. Fortress war was a boutique craft, a watchmaker's art. In reverse, you unmade the intricate work of another watchmaker. It needed special keys, special hammers, special patience things the Americans in German imagination did not purchase. Even reports from Brest and the first rings of Metz failed to dent the confidence. Those were anomalies, said the tidy story, local advantages poorly cited, works morale issues, weather. The line officers scratched observe in margins and returned to their range cards. The west wall and the old rings around fortress towns were not farmhouses. Their cupolas were born of another Europe, one that understood siege mathematics. If anything could stop haste and mass, it would be stone instructed by geometry. So they laughed softly, professionally, the way men do when their experience tells them a thing and they are grateful for the thing. The enemy would arrive loud, hungry, beautifully equipped. He would bombard with aircraft and field guns, and the forts would wear the bombardment like rain. Then, according to plan, the infantry would break itself on interlocking arcs, and the counterpunch would land. Concrete, they thought, was still a noun that frightened verbs. They had an answer for everything the Americans they imagined would do. They did not yet have an answer for the Americans they were about to meet. It began with quiet that didn't feel like mercy. The guns along the belt had learned the enemy's noise, the busy chatter of 105s, the rolling drum of 155s, the wasp swarm prelude of fighter bombers. This was different air, like held breath horizons smudged by weather, the kind of gray that makes distance lie. Listening posts reported nothing unusual, far truck noises, the occasional clang of a track on stone, a bird startled into a ragged flight. The telephone nets murmured routine checks. Men cleaned weapons they'd cleaned already. Coffee steamed in helmets. The fortress waited. The waiting hollowed them. A fortress thrives on certainty, the brick-by-brick reassurance of procedures executed under roofs that have already proven themselves. But the rumor of wait had slipped into the galleries weeks ago and would not leave. A new American mortar, a naval piece inland, a giant howitzer that travels in parts like a carnival. The engineers made the sign of skepticism and wrote on clipboards, but engineers sleep too, and in the dark, they felt the rumor walk the corridors. What if the enemy had finally decided to converse with concrete in its own slow grammar? Sound-ranging units inked triangles on paper as dawn turned to tarnish. The lines didn't agree. The source felt farther than it should, lower than it should, as if the noise were crawling along the ground rather than flying through the air. Meteor reports spoke of inversions and wet layers. The counter-battery officer tapped his pencil and waited for a signature he knew by heart, the bright, impatient spikes of American field guns. The spikes didn't come. Somewhere beyond the ridge, something rehearsed minutes rather than seconds. The men in the cupolas watched through slits that framed the world like a photograph, broken orchards, a road ribboning behind hedges, an American OP you could feel more than see with a handset, and a man who had memorized your angles. You could convince yourself the enemy had paused to bring up more of the same tank's infantry air. You could not shake the sense that he had paused to bring up something else. Silence makes time elastic. 10 minutes stretch like wire. An hour snaps back unexpectedly, leaving you tired and hungry and aware of your heartbeat in your teeth. The chaplain made his rounds and left words shaped for comfort, in rooms shaped for endurance. A sergeant checked his men's earplugs and made a joke about how the Americans at least were punctual. Laughter sounded like metal. Mid-morning, a tremor. Not the hammer on anvil of a near field piece, not the hollow cough of a mortar, but a long, low shove that touched the soles first. Dust fell in a fine, honest drift from a seam nobody had noticed. Men looked up with the same expression men wear when a doctor frowns at a chart. The tremor stopped. Someone said quarry. Someone else said nothing at all. The order was simple and helpless: stand by for counter battery, report effects. The nets crackled as posts checked in, ready, ready, ready. In the plotting room, an engineer captain revised his assumptions in pencil lighter than truth. A runner passed with fresh fuses for the casemates. The fort breathed like a lung built of rooms. Above, in the gray that had not moved all morning, a distant thud like a door closing in a cathedral. Then the first arrival. It did not tear. It pressed. The roof took the load, learned it too quickly, and sent the lesson down through pillars and bulkheads until cups leapt and teeth clicked. This one fell short. The second wrote its name on the glacis with a gouge that bled stone. The third found some seam older than the war and persuaded it to remember. After each, the silence returned more eloquent, like a conductor holding a rest, to teach an orchestra how to fear the next note. In those rests lived the problem. No plan had annotated, not courage, not ammunition, not training. It was the recognition that the enemy had chosen to fight the fortress as a fortress, with a patience equal to stone and a weight calibrated for roofs measured in meters. Men can resist blast. Geometry can misdirect splinters. But waiting for a clock that rings once every few minutes and erases a piece of your building each time works on the soul the way water works on limestone. By noon, phones still functioned. Maps still showed fields of fire, and orders still traveled. The line held because the line was made of men. But the rooms felt smaller, the air older, the roof closer. The storm had not broken in the old sense. It had installed itself like weather that meant to winter here. And in the hush between impacts, every listener learned a new acoustics mass has a sound. And once you've heard it, you cannot persuade yourself that doctrine weighs more. Shift the map one valley west, and the quiet resolves into choreography. What the Germans inside the concrete feel as a rumor is outside a visible machine, surveyors planting tripods in hedgerow shadows. Wire teams unreeling line-like veins across damp fields. Bulldozers nosing at shoulders of earth to cut turnouts strong enough for giants. The impossible idea is not one weapon. It is the decision to fight the fortress on fortress terms, bring a traveling siege to a war that swore it no longer had time for sieges. At first light, a column arrives piecemeal, unremarkable to anyone who doesn't know the shapes. A high-speed tractor with armor plates like tired knuckles, exhaust breathing in white. Behind it, a low, many-wheeled trailer that seems to carry emptiness until you notice the cradle, the rails, the fittings machined to tolerance. Another tractor follows with a boxy burden stenciled in letters that don't need translation, 240 mm. A wrecker lingers patient as a vulture. The road guards wave traffic around as if this were ordinary freight. Nothing about it is ordinary. Engineers speak a language of inches and minutes. They have scouted the firing position with air photos and mud on boots, tested soil compaction, measured arc of fire through gaps in trees that will be there at dawn but gone by noon. Stakes go in. A pad grows out of the field with the dignity of a foundation. A camouflage net blooms from poles, its geometry broken with brush and burlap. A fake barn painted by someone who knows how eyes lie to themselves under stress. The command post unrolls on a trestle table map. Protractors grease pencils the range tables that will turn ground into math. The howitzer arrives as a conversation among cranes. The barrel is not mounted so much as introduced to its carriage with the etiquette of weight jacks. Chirp slings, strain men sing numbers 2 inches. 1. Half until metal meets metal with a kiss. Grease guns whisper at bearings. A breech face round and polished like a vault door rotates open to prove it can. The section chief checks torques by feel and by faith. A loader runs his hand over the projectile rail, the way a sailor touches a keel, a little superstition to square the physics. Around the gun, an organism forms. The fire direction center in a nearby thicket takes target requests from forward observers who crawled into church belfries and attic crawl spaces last night. Weather teams push up a balloon rad wind at height and mutter corrections into the net. A liaison officer from the engineers talks quietly about roof thicknesses and rebar patterns in the ring forts ahead. Trucks bring the shells like a slow tide, each one a heavy promise in drab paint. A cook arrives with coffee nobody will remember drinking. The chaplain walks through and says nothing at all. Higher up the slope, field artillery in places, as if laying down punctuation 105s and 155s to keep the enemy's head down and to erase bad habits from nearby streets. Far back, the coarse guns 8-inch and the long-legged 155 guns that throw distance like a lariat wait to join the sentence. And beyond earshot, out on the pale channel, a destroyer noses along the coast like a surgeon's tool, radio nets, braided into the land fight, in case the day's math needs the sea's hammer. The impossible part isn't the medal. It's the patience. The Americans choose to spend hours that doctrine told them never to spend building a stage big enough for a single heavy voice. Every 10 minutes, another piece clicks into place, a generator coughs to life. A line is laid, a reference point is staked with a strip of white cloth. By mid-morning, the battery breathes as one animal with 4 hearts. The section chief looks through the sight, sees a world framed by crosshairs and numbers, and nods once. The forward observer calls in a grid with the calm of a man reporting the weather. The lanyard is a small thing in a big hand. Fire mission battery 1 round. He adjusts. In the fort, men will feel a tremor. They will not know how to name. Out here under nets that smell like wet rope and sap, the idea becomes pressure in a barrel, and a shell coasting up toward a gray sky carrying an argument nobody can ignore. The attack begins like a sentence written by several authors at once. First, the light guns speak 105mm howitzers, walking a curtain along trench lines and lanes to freeze movement, to make runners choose between shrapnel and slowness. Their rhythm is quick conversational, a drum roll that keeps heads down. The 155s add clauses, heavier bursts at junctions, suspected OPs, and the mouths of communications trenches. Smoke builds in tasteful piles where planners want the enemy to look. Silence remains where truth waits. Above the curtain, a thin ceiling of cloud, low and grudging, gives and takes. When it lifts, fighter-bombers slide in 2s and 4s. Throttles, low noses, tipped rockets shearing into known strongpoints, cannon tasting the edges of courtyards. They are punctuation, not thesis, brief strokes to dazzle optics, to knock out a flak pit that forgot humility. The forts, as predicted, mostly shrug off the aircraft. That's part of the plan. Let the cupolas believe the old story for 10 minutes longer, because the thesis rolls forward on tracks. On a net that binds valley to ridge, a forward observer reads a grid square that corresponds to a rooftop a mile away that looks like every other rooftop. The FDC computes and recomputes wind at altitude, powder temperature, air density. Shot. The battery chief watches the first 240mm round begin a day's work from the cradle up the recoil system, bracing itself like a wrestler's legs. The shell, 360 pounds of intention, departs in slow majesty that feels faster than it looks. Riding a trajectory that was a diagram on a classroom wall yesterday, and is now a promise to a piece of concrete that thought it knew the future. The sound arrives at the fortress in 2 parts, a distant thud, too slow to fear on instinct, and long enough later for a man to lie to himself, the arrival that remakes rooms. Penetration on an old glacis is a lesson taught at obliquity. The fuse senses its task and delays counting thickness, like a banker counts coins, then spends itself inside. Doors bow, lights fail, dust makes a new weather. Observers adjust by miles, not yards. Drop 1-0, left 1. A second round writes a parallel sentence deeper into the roof. The 155s mark time around the edges, bullying sally ports and wire with the steady insult of HE fragmentation. The 105s keep the trenches honest. The sky sends commas when it can. And then the infantry begins its long claws, short dashes between shell bursts, white tape laid over wreckage, to define lanes through a place that cannot remember being streets. Tanks hunch forward like patient cattle guns, level coaxials pricking at embrasures that still spit. Engineers move with satchels and fuses like priests with relics. Everything that moves, moves because the heavy gun has made a space in the wall where movement has meaning. The secret sauce isn't a single ingredient. It's proportion. Enough weight to matter, enough patience to place that weight, exactly enough logistics to do it again tomorrow, 1 ridge over. Rates of fire are low because they are deliberate, 1 round every 3-4 minutes, from each 240, a cadence that teaches the enemy to hate clocks. Ammunition comes forward in an exercise in faith. Each shell craned, trundled, swabbed into the throat breech shut, with a sound that has always meant soon. The FDC keeps a ledger of physics. The observers keep a ledger of effects. The battery chief keeps a ledger of men. When a cupola finally goes, it goes suddenly like a magician, revealing a trick that was only ever physics. One moment, a round steel hat. The next, a howl of escaping pressure and a ring of teeth on the parapet. Communications falter not because lines are cut, though many are, but because the talkers have nothing hopeful to say. A reserve section moves to a counterattack start line and finds the start line gone. A machine gun team sets up to enfilade a lane and discovers there is no lane anymore, only an argument between stone and blast that has not finished. The last refinement is mercy that isn't mercy. The heavy guns shift to the next node, while the medium artillery and mortars pick up the conversation inside the ruins, shaping routes, isolating pockets, giving sappers a geometry of shock. The sea, if the sea is in reach, adds a bass note from a ship you cannot see. Overhead planes scrawl brief signatures and are gone. The infantry, always the verdict, steps through smoke that smells like damp books and bad wiring. Behind it all, under nets that sag with dew, the 240s sit with breeches open, crews black-fingered and expressionless, already taking corrections for the next fort, whose roof believes it is the past. The sauce is not mystical. It is tables and trucks, bearings and balloons, men who can wait, and a barrel that speaks slowly in a language concrete cannot pretend not to understand. October 18th, 1944, 0640 hours. Aachen sector. The battle begins with a mistake you only notice afterward. The watch officer writes the weather as steady, low cloud, as if the sky were a lid that could be trusted. The first heavy arrival at 0651 turns that trust into a superstition. The cupola above post 12 coughs dust in a fine cone. The telephone operator wipes grit from his tongue and says Störung kurz, disturbance brief, but the briefness grows teeth. At 0657, the counter-battery map lays down a neat triangle over the next ridge. Orders rattle through the net flak batteries, depress for ground targets. The 10.5 centimeter guns on Spur B fire harassing missions on suspected American OPs. Mortar Platoon 3 throws smoke at the orchard line. The words are correct. The world refuses the words. The orchard is already a shredded negative. The OP is not where it should be, but 3 houses to the left. Smoke only paints panic. Runners begin to die. The first, a thin boy who still writes home every second Sunday, vanishes in a fragment storm, while crossing an alley he has crossed 100 times. The second staggers into the lower gallery, with a message scissored by shrapnel into confetti. By 0725, the staff captain stops sending runners. He stares at the mess tin on his desk and realizes it has been ringing like a bell with each impact. He places his hand on it until the ringing transfers to his bones. The nets fray. On the A circuit, post 9 calls Feuerpause in a voice that can't decide whether it's a question or a plea. There is no pause. There is only cadence, one vast knell every few minutes that turns corridors into opinions about geometry. A power blink forces the switchboard man to repatch by muscle memory. A misplugged line feeds the chaplain into the artillery net. For 30 seconds, doctrine argues with prayer. By 0810, command is formally intact and functionally scattered. The map shows fields of fire. The fields have become fields of rubble. The company on the right claims to be holding the crossroad. The crossroad is a pothole inside a crater that has eaten its own name. The battalion commander, a clear-eyed major, whose voice usually flies straight and level, moves his CP deeper, then deeper again, until deeper and down no longer mean the same thing, because the roof has learned how to breathe. He orders the reserve to assemble for a local counterattack along the tramline. The tramline exists in doctrine and memory, not in stone. Engineers with satchel charges and the square patience of craftsmen attempt to restore movement. They shore a door that cannot remember being vertical. They brace a corridor with timbers that tremble like exhausted legs. Their sergeant, a man who believes in angles, listens to the next 240 arrive and realizes angles have turned traitor. He draws a triangle on his palm with a stub of pencil and rubs it away with his thumb. At 0900, the light artillery curtain lifts for the length of a sigh, then drops on a new grid. The infantry claws toward the wire under this moving roof of violence. A machine gun in an embrasure knocks 2 men down 3-4. Then the embrasure forgets itself in a fountain of stone. The gun team on the second deck tries to swing to a new lane and finds the lane inhabited by a wall that was a doorway earlier this morning. They adapt. Adaptation is bravery's last craft. The gun barks into dust, because dust is where the enemy now lives. The battalion attempts a counterattack with what it can gather: 2 storm squads, a half-dozen men from a signals detachment, a medic who refuses to be told he is not assault infantry. They reach the old tram shed at 0927 and discover it has been unbuilt by distributed intention. 105s have combed it. 155s have parted it. The heavy round has pronounced sentence. The assault stalls not from fear, but from lack of nouns. There is nowhere left that can be called a flank. The staff tries to recompose the picture. Reports flood and evaporate. Post 7 is wahrscheinlich intact, probably intact until a note. 6 minutes later reads, Post 7 unklar, then Post 7 verstummt, then nothing. The adjutant draws a thin X over the symbol and adds a question mark that looks to an outside eye like an act of hope. He is not hopeful. He is documenting the vanishing. At 10:15, a shell arrives without immediate detonation and moves the air in the command room like a large animal turning in sleep. The fuse chooses its moment with monstrous politeness. The blast takes down the outer wall, but leaves the map pinned to its board, a joke with a moral. The major stands in the white roar aftersound and realizes he is standing in a room that no longer deserves the noun. He orders the CP moved again. A corporal begins to coil cable and finds his hands doing the work of a much older man. North of the fort, an armored patrol attempts to nose forward along a sunken lane and is forced backward by nothing they can see, just a rain that walks toward them with measured steps. The section leader names it correctly on the net, heavy howitzer, and feels strange relief as if knowing the animal's name gives it rules. It doesn't. The rules are logistical and they are not his. By late morning, the command system remains in the air like a bridge after its piers have washed out. Orders cross, acknowledgements drift. A company withdraws 2 basements to the rear and reports it as maintaining position because the map lacks verbs for the subterranean. The major composes a message to regiment that says the situation is fluid, which is a way of saying it has melted. He asks for ammunition and is embarrassed at the reflex even as he speaks. Ammunition is not the currency being spent. Time is, and the enemy owns a bank. When the heavy cadence briefly falters, a gun cooling a traverse corrected a truck reversing under trees, the fort hears its own heart and mistakes it for reprieve. Then the bell tolls again, and the reprieve becomes memory. Leadership narrows to the size of rooms. Men obey voices they can touch. The system has not collapsed in the way reports like to write. It has been sanded down layer by layer until only the grain remains, and the grain runs toward surrender unless physics changes its mind. The realization does not arrive as an idea. It arrives as a rhythm. Every 3 to 4 minutes, a judgment falls from a sky that is not emotional. Men can hate opponents and defy doctrine. They cannot intimidate mass. The fortress learns this the way cliffs learn the sea, not via argument, but by abrasion measured in heartbeats. At noon, the heavy gun shifts its attention to the cupola that has been the position's pride since a previous century. 2 rounds persuade it to think about its ancestry. A third removes its ability to remember. The turret ring buckles like a belt after a winter of hunger. Inside, a loader whose hands have never once fumbled a shell looks down at a fragment, recognizes a serial number meant to be on the outside, and laughs the way people laugh when presented with a magic trick performed by gravity. The phone to regiment catches breath and dies. The reserve platoon becomes a rumor passing left to right. A runner appears with a message that says, "Hold absolutely," and the company commander folds it in half and uses it to wedge a door that keeps crawling inward. He holds absolutely, but the absolutes have moved. His machine gun is now an artifact. His field of fire is a room. His men live in the subtext of a plan that once held nouns like courtyard and lane and flank. They replace them with gap, pocket, hole. The lexicon shrinks to things you can touch. The Americans do not rush. This is the most terrifying kindness of the machine. It does not sprint for glory. It schedules outcomes. The heavy battery speaks with the restraint of a clerk checking boxes. Objective 1, Objective 2, interval repeat. When aircraft come, and they come in streaks, when the cloud grudgingly lifts, they are commas, agreeable and brief. When the medium guns change sheaves, it feels like someone turning a page. The infantry's advance is a slow, literate finger underlining a sentence already written in concrete dust. A lieutenant in the plotting room, a student of ballistics before the war, turned numbers carnivorous, redraws trajectories from sound reports, and cannot make the line sit inside the fortress doctrine he loves. The ranges are too far for their own counter-battery. The angles too shallow to be mortars. The accuracy too deliberate for luck. He writes 240 in the margin and circles it twice. He realizes that even if he's wrong by a digit, he's not wrong about the category the enemy has chosen, weight, and chosen to feed it, as if feeding a factory. He closes the notebook and tucks it in his tunic like a book of hours. By mid-afternoon, discipline remains the stout professional kind that keeps men from inventing exits where none exist, but hope begins to misunderstand itself. The defenders keep firing because firing is what makes them soldiers. They relocate because relocation is what keeps them alive. A squad takes up position in a boiler room and discovers the boiler is now sunlight. They move to a coal bin and find the coal spread evenly through the air. You can adapt to almost anything in war except subtraction that never stops. On the surface, the signs look familiar, white tape marking American lanes, tanks nosing and pausing, engineers with satchels and fuses, medics dragging litters through a charred labyrinth. Beneath the surface, a different picture: trucks that never seem to be empty straps, that never quite slacken, a quiet procession of shells whose individuality does not matter, because the category is infinite. The fortress men are not cowards. They simply count. How many rounds left for the 10.5s? How many for the mortars? How many doors that still open? Then they listen to the enemy count not shells, not even guns, but minutes. The realization lies there, cold, perfectly shaped. The Americans have made time into a weapon and logistics into fate. A second cupola goes. This one takes longer, stubborn like an old officer who hates new forms. When it finally fails, the commander stops feeling personally insulted by physics. He takes off his cap, smooths his hair with fingers black with cement, and looks at his men as if he's seeing them in a photograph that will live in someone else's drawer. He gives orders that are correct and smaller than the situation. He sends a report that is honest and useless, holding in place, losses heavy, enemy fire systematic, concrete degradation widespread. He doesn't know the phrase degradation belongs to materials science. He feels it in his joints. Toward evening, a lull that feels like the sky catching its breath. In the lull, a rumor: we have destroyed one of the American guns. It moves along the gallery like a candle in a mine warming faces. It is untrue not because the defenders are incompetent, but because the target is not a gun. It is a system that can afford a damaged wheel and keep moving. 10 minutes later, the cadence resumes, and the rumor dies the way small animals die in winter without ceremony, exactly as the season intended. The Axis realization is not that the enemy is brave. Everyone is brave. It is not that he is rich. Everyone knows he is rich. It is that richness has been engineered into an instrument whose patience is bottomless. The fortress had bet on timelessness. The Americans brought a calendar with no end. You do not defeat a calendar with audacity. You negotiate with it, and its terms are simple: surrender, sooner save lives. Surrender later, feed the arithmetic. When the white cloth appears, not yet a flag, just a strip waved in a stairwell, to beg a pause long enough to pull a bleeding man across a bite of daylight, the machine honors it for a minute, and then resumes speaking elsewhere because mercy is tactical and outcomes are strategic. The company commander who wedges doors with written absolutes finally sees an absolute. He recognizes a wall that is now floor. He orders a fallback 2 rooms, then 3, then to the deep shelter. He signs the surrender when the hour ripens, not because he is broken, but because he has become a realist. Afterward, when questioned, he will say the sentence that matters. Not that the Americans were many or clever or lucky, though they were all 3. He will say they had a way of making the next blow inevitable. The interviewer will nod, as if this were an opinion. It is a measurement. The coda of the realization is quiet, the heavy howitzers cooling under nets, the tractors yawning into harness, The FDC rolling maps that will unroll one ridge to the east tomorrow. The fortress men listen to the silence and understand what it means. A machine that can rest like this between victories is not merely strong, it is endless. In the weeks after Aachen's fortresses learned humility maps changed faster than briefings. What failed on that gray October morning was not merely a position, it was a philosophy. The West Wall and the 19th century rings around fortress towns had promised to trade time for blood at favorable rates. The 240mm answered with a new exchange. It turned time itself into ammunition and spent it with industrial calm. Once commanders understood that the Americans could plant a traveling siege wherever roads and tractors could breathe, the shape of defense collapsed inward. Strongpoints became islands. Islands begged ferries. The ferries never came. Operationally, the long-range consequence was simple and devastating. German staffs could no longer rely on roof endurance to buy days for counterattacks to form. The calendar, once a weapon of the defender, joined the attacker. Corps and army reserves moved to chase rumors rather than opportunities. Artillery parks hid deeper, fired less, influenced little. Infantry learned to hold basements instead of blocks, and basements don't maneuver. When Brest, Metz, and Aachen all told the same story, heavy patient preparation followed by deliberate reduction, higher headquarters stopped planning ripostes with fortress pivots and began writing withdrawals in pencil they pretended was ink. Strategically, the machine tightened the noose without drama. Every fortress reduced by weight freed air power and medium artillery to shape the next week's fight. Every road built to nurse a 240 forward became a pipeline for fuel rations and relief arteries the Americans kept after the guns rolled east. German logistics, already bled by distance and disruption, now faced a predator that did not need surprise to win. It needed only continuity. The result was a cascade. Garrisons surrendered earlier to preserve cadres. Engineers conserved explosives for bridges rather than bunkers. Staffs measured success in hours delayed, not lines held. The myth of the immovable wall died quietly, replaced by a new arithmetic, whispered in command posts. If they want this place, they will bring the calendar, and the calendar cannot be flanked. The man who signs the surrender at dusk does not rehearse speeches. He folds his cap, rubs powdered concrete from his knuckles, and walks the Americans through rooms that are now arguments settled. Later, much later, someone asks him what it felt like. He looks past the interviewer to a window that frames a harmless street and says the line that has followed him from sleep to waking. We were fighting a machine. He does not mean dehumanized enemies or chrome. He means cadence. He means the way a single heavy report returned every few minutes with the inevitability of a clock unmoved by rage or pleading. He remembers holding a door with a message that read, "Hold absolutely," and learning that absolutes had migrated to the other side of the map. He remembers how rumors of a destroyed gun, of reserves arriving, of a lull turning permanent, died exactly on schedule, as if mercy itself had adopted a timetable. A signals corporal writes in a thin notebook he keeps hidden from himself. They did not hurry. They arranged. An engineer once proud of angles and trusses admits that his calculations were correct and irrelevant. Our geometry was perfect until their logistics entered the room. A young private, later a baker, tells his son that the most terrible sound of the war was not the blast, but the silence between blasts, because it taught you to measure your fear with someone else's watch. None of them claimed the Americans were supermen. They were attentive men serving a system that fed them weight-rest replacements and numbers that added up. The survivors do not turn this into romance. They render it as fact. The roof cracked, the cupola failed, the phone died. The next round came, the door became a wall, the wall became light, asked for a final judgment. The captain, who once believed in stone, clears his throat. Bravery counts, he says softly. But there are wars where patience counts more. They had more patience than we had days. He hesitates, then adds the epitaph for his forts and for an era. We were fighting a machine, and machines that keep their schedule do not lose.